Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Karen Donfried with the German Marshall Fund, and we are so excited to welcome you to this book launch for my wonderful colleague, Derek Chollet. If you haven't bought the book already, it's called The Long Game: How Obama Defied Washington and Redefined America's Role in the World. I have actually read it, so I can say that it is riveting, it's thoughtful, it's thought-provoking, and it really is the first longer look at the foreign policy of President Obama. There are very few people better positioned than Derek to write that kind of a book because of the many years he spent working for President Obama. And I really want to encourage everyone not only to buy a copy for themselves, but it's that time of year, graduations. What high school or college graduate wouldn't better appreciate a book about foreign policy? But also I want to encourage you to tweet about the event. So the hashtag is very clever, hashtag The Long Game. So please give as much publicity as you can to Derek's book. Along with being excited about Derek having finished this project, I'm also really excited that we have David Ignatius here to moderate the conversation about Derek's book. David is known, I'm sure, to everybody in this room because of the column he does for the Washington Post, but much more importantly, he is a trustee of the German Marshall Fund, and he's been an incredible and loyal supporter to GMF. And along with his many accolades, I would say he is a moderator extraordinaire. And Derek very much was hoping David would be able to do this. So David, we're so grateful to you. And I'm going to turn it over to the two of them. Thanks so much for being here.
So thanks to Karen. It's wonderful to have this as a GMF in-house event. One of the many good things that Karen has done as our president was to bring Derek to GMF. I've seen him do some marvelous things. How he also managed to write this terrific book, I'm not quite sure. Derek's book is, as Karen said, one of the early attempts to make sense of the foreign policy successes and failures of this president. It continues a dialogue that was begun most notably by Jeffrey Goldberg's Atlantic article, but this is book length, more careful, and obviously benefits from Derek's intimate involvement in the policy process. There's some fascinating moments in the book where Derek will make reference to things he saw, was part of, sat in the Situation Room advising about, and that's one of the values of the book. I want to jump into the core question that Derek is exploring in The Long Game, which is how we should evaluate this foreign policy. And I want to quote something that Derek writes in setting the stage for his analysis. He asks, have Obama's policies diminished or strengthened America's position in the world? And that puts the question as directly as possible. So I want to start there with Derek and ask you for your initial thoughts about whether we as a country are stronger or less strong after these 7, almost 8 years.
Well, thanks, David, and thanks for all of you for being here. Since this is the first official book event, I hope you'll indulge me just for a second to thank GMF and my close colleagues here for giving me the space to write this book and for being such a terrific home for me. I could not have picked a better place when I left the government after 6+ hard years of service. To come here and be able to work with my friend and former colleague, Karen Donfried, was a real treat. And she has read the book, and she improved it, saved me from many mistakes in the book. So I'm really proud to be here to have this first event. And David, thanks to you for doing this. You're someone who, we talked a lot when I was in government, someone who I learned from at least a couple times a week when you write your columns for the Post. So it's really great to engage in this dialogue with you as such a careful observer of this administration for so many years. So really, I'm glad you read that quote, because that really is kind of the heart of why I wanted to write this book, which was, as we're approaching the end of the Obama administration, for us to try to take a step back and think of what the president accomplished, or what perhaps did he not accomplish that he regrets in retrospect. I argue in this book, as wouldn't be surprising from the title, that if you measure by our position in the world, that the United States is in a better position in almost every dimension to accomplish the long-term goals that this president set out to do. We're in a better position here at home. Our economy is much stronger. We've addressed many very difficult issues that the president inherited in 2008 when he was elected. And across the world. The world is full of troubles, and I do not deny any of the troubles that we face in the world. But in many instances, the world has always been troubling. And I try to remind people that if we were sitting here in June of 1968, we'd be talking about 500,000 American troops in South Vietnam and Soviet tanks in Prague and an American political system that was ripping itself apart on the streets, which that was a pretty troubling inheritance. 1979 was a pretty difficult period of time as well, with American hostages in Iran and Soviets in Afghanistan and a worldwide energy crisis. So the question is not so much, is the world troubling? It's how best can the U.S. be positioned to bring countries together and use the various tools that it has to try to solve problems and give people an opportunity to make their lives better. And I think across the board, the United States is in a better position. That doesn't mean that we are winning every fight. It doesn't mean that we're exactly where I think we would want to be. And clearly, the president, as he's leaving office, is expressing areas that he regrets and things that he wished could have gone differently. And certainly Secretary Clinton in her campaign, it's not a repudiation of what's come before. It's in many ways a continuation, but also an augmentation, ways that we're pick up where President Obama's left off and try to make things better. So unfortunately, in the debate today, and this I get into some of the what I see as the challenges of the foreign policy debate in this book, the debate today would tell you a very different story. The debate today says, the U.S. is a failure. The president didn't live up to his expectations. There's all these troubles in the world. We're not doing enough about them. And it gives you a very different picture of where the United States is that I actually I don't think it reflects reality. I think the president, he doesn't believe it reflects reality, and actually Secretary Clinton doesn't believe it reflects reality. So what I'm trying to do in this book is take a first cut at the way I think history will look at the Obama foreign policy. And so the title, The Long Game, is a double meaning. The first is I believe President Obama plays a long game. I think he has what academics would call a grand strategy, and that he has been pretty disciplined and ruthless about trying to implement that strategy, which involves making difficult trade-offs about where the U.S. should invest its resources and where it shouldn't. But also I contend in this book that in history's long game, the Obama foreign policy will be looked upon as extremely consequential for the better.
So the question of whether America is stronger or weaker today than it was 7 years ago is complicated, and it will take a long time, I think, to get a reliable account of that. But isn't it fair to say, Derek, that America in most major capitals around the world is perceived to be weaker than it was? And isn't, whatever else one would say about the president's grand strategy, is it fair to fault him for not managing perceptions as well as he needed to? Because in this world, the perception that you're weak is almost as damaging as being weak.
So again, David, I look out at the various strategic arenas that matter the most to us. Let's even think of it geographically. Look at the American position in Asia. I contend that our position in Asia is much stronger than it was 7 years ago. Of course, this administration famously pursued a rebalancing strategy towards the challenges of the Asia Pacific. When President Obama came into office, meetings like this were talking about the G2 and the rise of the BRICS and how it was really returning to a multipolar world with the United States in decline, with the U.S. economy tanking, and with the U.S. being bogged down in wars with no end in sight, seemingly, in 2008. very different position today in Asia. We've strengthened some key alliances, opened new partnerships in Southeast Asia in particular. And China is a very complicated relationship, as I'm sure we'll get into later, but I feel like the U.S. position vis-a-vis China is pretty strong today. Look at Europe. Yes, Europe has tremendous problems. We talk about them in this very room many times a week. But most of those problems are not about the United States. And in fact, the United States is in a better position today, I would argue, in Europe than it was 10 years ago. President Obama, despite the fact he maybe has not lived up to the wildly high expectations that were placed upon him when he entered office, is more popular than pretty much every other European leader in their own country. And the United States is still looked to set an agenda, to be a leader, whether it's solving problems like climate change or dealing with problems like terrorism. You look at Latin America, sea change in our position in Latin America. Again, 2009, the United States would go to multilateral gatherings in Latin America, and we were the outlier country. It was the Venezuelas on the resurgence. It was the Brazils that were leading. It was the U.S. is seen as kind of the cowboy country that was the outlier. Now, for a lot of reasons, partly because of the price of oil, so some of these Latin American economies have tanked, but also because of the opening to Cuba, the U.S. is in a very different position in Latin America. The one region of the world which has been the most troubling for President Obama, as it was the most troubling for his predecessor, is the Middle East. And I would argue that, first of all, we're deeply engaged in the Middle East. There's this myth of U.S. disengagement in the Middle East, perhaps we can get into a little later. But I think when it comes to solving the challenges of the Middle East, which are fundamentally not about the United States, we're witnessing in the Middle East today a once in a century political, social, economic, security convulsion. The question is, how best can we bring the various tools we have, bring those to bear to try to help solve those problems? It's not perfect. There are many, and I get into this in the book, there are many instances that I think we in retrospect, we would have wanted to do things differently. But again, I feel like we're in a pretty good position to be addressing those problems relative to our other interests around the world. And I think that's the key part also for President Obama. It's not just what are we doing in a particular place. It's how is what we're doing in that particular part of the world, the Middle East or Asia or the Europe or Latin America, how does it fit within a larger strategy? So I argue President Obama has a strategy. It's a strategy that involves difficult decisions and trade-offs about priorities and resources and diplomatic, economic, and military bandwidth. Oftentimes in the debate here in Washington, it's not necessarily reflective of a strategy. It's reflective of what more are we going to do to solve a particular problem without any reference to how that will affect our ability to solve other problems.
So that's a good takeoff point for me to ask you a question that I previewed with you before we came up on stage, and that is to help us unravel the relationship, I want to say the strange relationship between the president and what you call in your book Washington's foreign policy establishment. I told Derek that I'd heard somebody from the White House say that a lot of pundits who write about foreign policy, unnamed, but I suspect that one of them is sitting up here, are viewed by the White House, sometimes described by the White House as the Russian judges. And you'll all remember in the Olympics where, the French judge goes, 5.6, and the Canadian judge goes 5.8, and then the Russian judge goes 4.2. And, again and again, the Russian judges just don't seem to be watching the same performance as everybody else. And the president, it's said, feels that way about people who write about foreign policy. And you've been inside the White House as people griped about coverage in the press.
As I told you, I never heard the Russian judges thing. I heard other things.
So I want you to, so what's going on here? Why is the president so peeved? And what do you think? Do you think the commentariat, if you will, has in fact been unfair to him and it just hasn't gotten it?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and I'm a card-carrying member of the establishment, right? I've worked in Washington, in and out of government, at think tanks and Capitol Hill and government for 20 plus years. So I don't claim to be an outsider, but what's been interesting to me is I puzzled over the debate about Obama's foreign policy, I try to ask the question, why is it so regarded as so bad? What is going on here? There's the question of it's just bad. Then there's maybe something about the debate. And I think first of all, with President Obama, it's important that this is not something he's learned in the last year. I mean, in many ways, he campaigned for president starting in 2007, making a case very similar to the one he made to Jeffrey Goldberg just a few months ago, which deep skepticism about the Washington establishment writ large, not just Republicans, who he's campaigning against in 2007, but against Congress, against the media, against elites, and the discourse overall. And I think he's frustrated often by the inability to learn from mistakes, to sometimes acknowledge mistakes, but certainly to learn from mistakes, to repeat lessons, to not learn lessons of the past and repeat failures of the past. And it's striking, actually, when you go back and read his speeches, which I then spent the last year doing, because I didn't have any time to read them when I was actually in government, is how you see the same phrases and language follow through from 2006 and 7 all the way to the present. So he does have a healthy degree of skepticism about the debate in Washington. And I think some of that is reflective of personal pique, certainly. I mean, I think every president has some animus towards the commentariat, so to speak. I can't think of a single one in recent history that hasn't at one point or another griped about the fact that they're not getting good press. Sorry, my phone is going off. And
this means that we're glad to be inside.
Oh, everybody! This is
sturdy
an emergency
building
alert.
because
Sorry,
we're having a
okay.
severe thunderstorm.
The flood warning. Luckily, we're on the second floor. It's a flood, Jim. Don't worry. It's, yeah, right. But there's also there's a different incentive system, and I've seen it now as I'm back in the pseudo commentariat here at GMF, where when you're the president, the way the president thinks, you get rewarded for long-term payoffs, right? And that's why I say it's a long game. Whereas in the commentariat, it's particularly today, it is all short-term. It's how can you get the most retweets? How can you make the biggest splash at the moment? And the president has decried this in terms of our overall political debate often. And I think it's particularly acute in the foreign policy debate. And I actually use a little author trick, David, that you'll appreciate in the book, where I unearth a long-forgotten book from 30 years ago to try to make a point. And one, it's a book called Our Own Worst Enemy by Les Gelb, Mac Dessler, and Tony Lake, which I think it's out of print, but I highly recommend everyone to read it because it's very prescient in terms of the condition about our foreign policy debate and how difficult it is for leaders to think strategically and get rewarded for thinking strategically. Part of the reason why I want to talk about that book is because it shows that, first of all, we had these same kind of arguments in the mid-1980s when President Reagan was in office, but also to reflect on how much worse it's gotten, and partly that's technology, partly that's our politics and how much more partisan our politics has become. And that one of the central struggles for the president in office has been dealing with this foreign policy breakdown, and that the incentives that drive the Washington debate are very different from the incentives that are necessary to think strategically. And the analogy I use is Obama is trying to be Warren Buffett, and the foreign policy debate tends to be dominated by day trading. And everyone's trying to make money. It's not like one is more morally superior than the other. But they're just two totally different perspectives in how you think about solving problems and getting rewarded for what you're doing.
So you said earlier that you think it's wrong to think of President Obama as having retreated, disengaged from the Middle East. But I want to ask you to think that through in more detail with us. And I'm going to recall something that Jeff Goldberg put in his piece when he was clearly summarizing conversations that he'd had with the president. And the president, by Jeff's account, said, As he thought about the Middle East, he thought the first thing that was clear to him was that the U.S. can't fix the problems of this region. I recently heard the Director of National Intelligence, Jim Clapper, say exactly the same thing to me in what I took to be kind of a baseline intelligence assessment. We can't fix it. Second thing the President told Jeff is that we don't need the Middle East, meaning Saudi and Gulf oil, in a way that we once did. That was once central to American security. Now, arguably, it isn't. And then third, that in trying to fix this thing that we can't fix, we just make more problems for ourselves. So the President decided, let's take some chips off the table. Let's reduce the degree of our exposure as a country to this set of intractable, insoluble problems. And that does look to me like disengagement. I mean, you can call it retreat, you can call it what you want, but it does look like stepping back. And the point that I've made in writing about Jeffrey's article and in conversations with you and others is that watching this process, I've concluded that as we step back, others step forward. It's not like you just step back and nothing else happens. So as we step back, the Russians step forward in a way we couldn't have predicted. As we step back, ISIS stepped forward. As we step back, Iran stepped forward. As we step back, Saudi Arabia in some ways that we're still going to, measuring, step forward. So is that, take the two points in sequence. First, isn't it true that the President really, in fact, did want to disengage to the extent possible from the Middle East? And second, is it true that that comes with costs, that as we do that, others do other things that may be damaging to our interests and those of our friends?
So you won't be surprised to hear me say it's a little more complicated than that. And I'm looking at my friend Ivo Dalder, who wrote a great book about the Bush administration called America Unbound. And I do not think the book about the Obama administration would be America Bound, that we've just constrained ourselves and we're stepping back from all of these problems. That's the narrative. That all this stuff's happening and we've been, checked out. But again, I look at the Middle East and I see us as very engaged. The biggest difference is we do not have 150,000 troops in Iraq. There's no question we disengaged from Iraq, as was, by the way, the plan that was inherited by President Obama, had been established by President Bush. I mean, most people only remember the December 2008 press conference that President Bush held in Baghdad with Maliki for the fact he had a shoe thrown at him. But that press conference was all about the SOFA agreement, which set out the timeline for withdrawal from Iraq. Now, President Obama actually had a more aggressive timeline than what he inherited, and he ended up sticking with that timeline. And we will, I'm sure, debate the wisdom of whether or not we should have stayed in Iraq in some fashion after 2011 and whether that was even possible. But when I look at our military footprint in the Middle East, which today, even before September of 2014 and the current ISIS campaign, we had more military capability in the region than we did pre-9/11 in terms of the number of troops, where we were located, as well as our operations in the Middle East. We've had record-setting arms sales to our Gulf partners in the Middle East in the last 7 years, as well as with the Israelis. And the administration's on the cusp of announcing a new MOU, Memorandum of Understanding with the Israelis, to only increase the assistance they will be getting from us militarily over the next 10 years. Controversially, a place like Egypt, that the United States, that President Obama became criticized for not cutting off the military relationship with Egypt when many believed and advocated that he should in the wake of the events there when Morsi left and al-Sisi came into power. The diplomatic engagement that the president has initiated with our Gulf partners to have these leader summits, which had never occurred before. But we've had Camp David and Riyadh last year and this year, for the first time, having these leader-level summits that he said he very much hopes, and I hope too, that his successors will maintain those. It fills a gap. In Asia and Europe, we have these summits all the time. We didn't ever do that in the Middle East, and now we are. to an Israeli relationship that at the political level has been tumultuous, no question about it. But for folks like me who are in the trenches working the defense and security relationship, it had never been better. So I don't see that as disengaging from the Middle East. I think it's a more arguably thoughtful engagement. It's engagement that is more sustainable over time in terms of the resources we're putting into it, as well as the support we can generate here at home. It's true that I think President Obama does not believe that the United States on its own can fix the problems of the Middle East. I actually don't think any countries in the Middle East believe that we can fix the problems of the Middle East. I think there might be some who want us to fix the problems of the Middle East or would hope that we had the ability to, but I don't see it. And so I think what the president's been resisting against, what I think has been the right call, is because of the illusion of our omnipotence and the belief that we can fix these problems, we end up getting into a situation where we invest too many of our resources, too much of our diplomatic bandwidth into these problems at the expense of other things we're trying to do around the world. So President Obama comes into office and he believes the United States is wildly out of balance when it comes to its position in the world, in terms of here at home and the challenges around the world. So rebalance was not just about a rebalance to Asia. It was about a rebalance in terms of where we were expending our resources, a rebalance in terms of the military instrument of power versus diplomacy and development, and a rebalance in terms of the priorities we place on what we're trying to do abroad to what we're trying to do here at home. A foreign policy is not successful if you're succeeding abroad but you're failing at home. They're inextricably linked. And I think he saw that, and I think he's proven to be right about that in terms of the strength at home is what's generating a lot of our improvement in our position abroad. But go back to your core point. I think there's this myth of disengagement from the Middle East that I don't buy.
So I want to be unbalanced for one more question, and then I'm going to move away from the Middle East. And last question I want to ask you about, Derek, is your thoughts about the views that expressed by 51 of your former colleagues in government, the 51 State Department officers, who in the dissent channel at the State Department, we can now read their memo because it was leaked, expressed their belief that the policy they were being asked to carry out to obtain a cessation of hostilities in Syria was unworkable because of the lack of military leverage. So they talked about the need to make the Assad regime, pay a greater price for its attacks on the opposition that we're supporting. But it was just in its purest form, the argument that military leverage is essential. Diplomacy without it is ineffective. And I'd be very curious about your reaction. Is that a letter that you would have signed? Do you have misgivings about what they're advocating? What do you think?
So obviously Syria is two chapters of the book, because I think Syria in many ways is the crucible for Obama's foreign policy. It presented the most difficult tests. And it's the part of Obama's record that those of us who served in the Obama administration, who worked on these issues, it's the most difficult to grapple with. It's the one that there's the most regret over. Even though I can't say in retrospect I have a lot of silver bullet solutions that if only I had been smarter or thought of this, we would be better off. But I do argue in the book that I try to look at this, problematize it, think of it from like a social science perspective of, okay, what could we have done differently? And there are some things that are not, and I've read this memo, which has now been made publicly available. I'm not sure if it was a leak or not, but it's on the internet. And a lot of what these folks are arguing is not that different from what I think we could have done differently, although I'm not sure it necessarily would have worked. I mean, in retrospect, we were too worried about retaliation by Assad militarily. I mean, we've been bombing Syria every single day since September of 2014. over, I don't know, 3,800 airstrikes against ISIS targets inside Syria. And I know it was true when I was at the Pentagon. We did that with zero consultation with the Assad regime. It was not as though someone from CENTCOM called up someone in Damascus and said, this is where we're going to be bombing today. We just did what we wanted. We owned the airspace. It was a de facto no-fly zone over the places we were operating in Syria. And we've done that without losing a pilot or even, as far as I know, even being under threat of any kind. So perhaps we could have started airstrikes sooner. Perhaps once we were conducting the airstrikes, we could have opened the aperture of the targets we were hitting, right? We were very careful legally and as a policy matter to only hit ISIS targets and to stay away from areas where the regime was operating. Perhaps we could have, and I was advocating for this at the time, hit some targets that were closer to regime targets, not necessarily to initiate mission creep and make this about Assad, not ISIS, but at least plant some seeds of doubt. We're worried about mission creep. Assad's worried about mission creep. So, let's perhaps maybe use ambiguity a little more. The concern that the president always expressed, and my former State Department colleagues have advocated, and what I say we could have done differently in the book don't remedy any of these concerns, is that it opens up a logic that leads to deeper and deeper intervention, leading to military regime change, and because it's always, well, then what? So we use our military leverage to try or use military force to try to gain leverage over Assad to get to the negotiating table. We'll say that doesn't work. Then we just have to ratchet up the pressure. Well, then say that doesn't work. And so the president's always saying, well, if the logical conclusion of this, if we play this out, is going to be us fully in militarily to take out Assad, and we're all saying that's not in our interest, then why would we open up a logic that would lead to that? Now, there's some of us in the government that would have been willing to play a little more with risk, but the president had good reasons not to want to play with that risk. And I think a debate that doesn't acknowledge those risks is one that doesn't serve our country well. And I think that that's part of probably what expresses it's behind some of the frustration that he expresses about the debate.
It's a very good answer, and it reminds us that through our modern history, the idea that bombing is a way to compel diplomatic outcomes.
There's a few examples, but not.
There are not many. Yeah. I mean, World War II is one long lesson right up until the use of the atomic bomb. That's not going to work. Well, so is Vietnam. Yeah. So anyway, that's
one piece of sort of backdrop here, which really matters when it comes to thinking about our policy choices in Syria, is the linkage between Srebrenica 20 years ago, Iraq, Libya, and Syria. Give me 1 minute on this. Right? For those of us, and President Obama was not one, because in the mid-1990s he was not thinking about being president of the United States or probably thinking that much about U.S. foreign policy. But for many of those in his administration, myself included, Srebrenica was one of those moments where we believed that our failure to act allowed a genocide to occur, and that the use of U.S. power after Srebrenica helped bring about the Dayton Accords and peace in the Balkans. And so the lesson we took from that is these are risks worth running. That led many of us, not all of us, but many of us to support the war in Iraq. To say, well, aside from WMD and for strategic reasons, just on humanitarian grounds alone, Iraq seemed to be a far stronger case than Bosnia. We supported the war in Iraq, and we saw how that turned out, which led to Libya. And the president tried to thread the needle on Libya. He saw what was happening on the ground in Libya, something that we called in the White House at the time Srebrenica on steroids, a humanitarian catastrophe looming that we had the power to do something about, and that Europe and the Middle Eastern partners wanted us to get involved. But yet, because of the lessons of Iraq, we wanted to ensure that our involvement did not lead into a massive nation-building effort and a drain on our time, energy, resources, prestige. And so the president sculpted a U.S. role that was controversial. That was the famous leading from behind the scenes role. Would have been a different debate if we had just said leading from behind the scenes, whoever had uttered those words. But where the U.S. was deeply involved, orchestrating the action, providing a lot of resources, but it was ultimately others we were allowing to be out front. But we saw how that turned out, right? And our former colleague Phil Gordon, came up with a great quip where in Iraq we intervened and we occupied, and we saw that turned out. In Libya we intervened, did not occupy, and we saw that turn out. In Syria we neither intervened nor occupied, and we saw that turn out. But for those of us sitting around the Situation Room table or back in our offices at the Pentagon or the White House or the State Department, trying to puzzle through what we were going to do on Syria, those lessons, those ghosts were all fighting with one another, which helps explain some of the knots we got tied up in and are still tied up in today on Syria.
So I want to ask one more question from up here and then turn to the audience for your questions, so please be thinking about them. I want to turn to Russia. You describe, I'm sure with precision, the way the president looked at the Putin problem after the invasion of Crimea and as the Ukraine intervention by proxy continued. And you describe him as seeing Russia as playing a fundamentally weak hand, as being badly overextended, unlikely to be able to sustain what it was doing, especially as it was sanctioned, and wanting always to leave an exit ramp so that when Russia exhausted this fundamentally flawed and weak policy, we would find a way for them to exit. I wrote a number of columns making exactly that same argument. That's the way I looked at it. It's the way a lot of people did. But as I look back, I'm wondering if that was right. Putin has been so good at playing this weak hand that in the process, he ends up becoming stronger. You can see that most clearly in Syria. So I want to ask you to talk about Russia and the Putin problem, but specifically in the context of Ukraine. And since this is my last question, add this additional fill-up. The rumors are racing around Washington that we are in the final stages of putting together a package that's an attempt to solve the Ukraine problem that Susan Rice said publicly with me a week ago that we're drafting the legislation that will be submitted to the Ukrainian parliament to facilitate some kind of resolution of the problem there. So talk about Russia and how it's played its hand in the Ukraine, and talk about whether you think in the remaining 6 months the president can finally get that exit ramp in a way that he will leave office with some resolution or stabilization in Ukraine.
So on the larger question of Russia, I guess I still, David, take issue with this idea that somehow Russia has gained the upper hand vis-a-vis the United States. I mean, Russia has fewer friends. Its economy is in the tank. It's overextended. There's a lot of questions about internally about Putin. Putin is in some ways oddly moderating some of his behavior, and some believe that that's acknowledgement that his weak hand has only gotten weaker. I mean, Putin's great at getting attention. He's great at surprising people. He's great at what I would say is kind of short-term actions. I mean, Putin to me is pretty similar to a certain presidential candidate that we have here in the United States, and I'm not being cute about that. Like, I think that if there's no doubt he can win a news cycle now and then, right? But is he setting up Russia for the long game? Analytically, I don't think there's any evidence that that's the case. Now, is he able to play, in areas where he already is, like in Syria? I mean, Russia's been in Syria from the very beginning. I mean, the problem in Syria, of the many problems in Syria, was Russian resupply of the Syrian military 4 or 5 years ago before they were directly involved. One of the only bright spots of the Syria debacle has been getting the chemical weapons out of Syria, which would not have happened without Russian cooperation. So the fact Russia is involved in Syria is not new. Now, they've escalated their role, certainly. Again, I don't know that that's. I can see how that's helped them within their narrow interest of improving their position in Syria, but it hasn't necessarily improved their position in the Middle East, because remember, they're helping the guy that everyone else in the Middle East, except for Iran, really hates. So I think it's also, it's just, if we think about Obama and Putin and kind of who's a better leader in terms of putting their country in a position to bring other countries by their sides, to help people solve their problems. I mean, it's telling to me that what often Obama gets criticized for doing here in the United States is not being more like Putin. And I just think we have to think about that. I mean, we actually are thinking about it in the context of this campaign, because we have one candidate who is offering a style of leadership that is pretty Putin-esque. And President Obama is definitely not that. But I think it brings in stark relief these two different styles of leadership and two different mindsets. But,
what about Ukraine and the chance of getting somewhere on that problem?
So, and again, this gets to another. How has Putin improved his position in Ukraine? He owns 8% of the country. That's Donbass, which is no great piece of territory. Meanwhile, 93% of Ukraine is fully in the open arms and embrace of Europe and the West. I mean, things that the United States was, when I was in the government, we never dreamed of doing some of the security and defense cooperation initiatives that we're doing now with Ukraine. In 2013, when I was in government, we spent about $8 million in security assistance to Ukraine. We've spent, since the fall or the spring of 2014, we spent $600 million in security assistance to Ukraine. I went into this business not to do math, so I don't know what percentage increase that is, but that's a big difference, right? And so that's training the Ukrainian military. It's helping their defense reform. It's helping them be more capable to defend themselves and be less corrupt at home. So that's pretty deep engagement with Ukraine that we were not doing before, and we never would have thought of doing before. So again, that's not Putin getting the upper hand in Ukraine. Now, getting to your question about Minsk, obviously I don't know what is in the offing. I know there's a U.S. delegation flying out there, I think, tonight. Clearly, there's I think in the anticipation of the Warsaw Summit, where there will be a meeting of some configuration of leaders with U.S. and Europe and Ukraine, something cooking, clearly. Because there's a lot of concern about the direction within Ukraine, some of the problems we've seen all along in terms of the corruption, the political dysfunction, and how that could be jeopardizing what we all want to see for Ukraine. I do not think it's the administration rushing to cut the deal with Putin in some way, but it's an attempt to try to save Ukraine in some ways from itself. I think the European ministers have agreed to re-up the sanctions in the last 48 hours. So that's good, but I think there's a lot of concern here in Washington and capitals in Europe about those being renewed again in December. So that's something that's, I'm sure, very much in the minds of my former colleagues in the administration.
So let us turn to the audience. If you could identify yourselves, please, and keep your questions short and to the point. I'm going to go all the way to the back, please.
Ignatius, my name's Steve Luckett. I work and study here in the city. I'd stand, but my legs are a little rubbery after having sat for a while. Two quick ones. To the degree that U.S.-Saudi relationship is pretty stinky.
Sorry, U.S.-Saudi?
Yeah.
Saudi.
How much worse will it be if the president authorizes the release of the unredacted 28 pages?
Yeah.
And shifting to the U.K., word on the Strasse is that Cameron is done. If the outvote goes, how could that impact U.S.-European relations? And thanks.
Sure, great questions. On the 28 pages, I have not read them, so I can't say what's in them. I mean, I know the Saudi foreign minister was here last week, and Saudi's been saying for a long time we should have them released, have them out there in the open, kind of demystify these. My understanding is the administration's actively working to get that done. So I guess this is a way of saying I have no reason to think that they would damage relations any further. Saudi relationship's pretty complicated as it is. On the UK, Brexit, future of Cameron, I think probably conventional wisdom that I share is, as you stated it, is right, which is if there is a Brexit vote, Cameron's probably out. I think that putting aside the particular individual leader in the UK, I think a Brexit vote, if nothing else, will be harmful to U.S. interests because Europe will just be further enveloped in an internal crisis, which will make it harder for us to work with Europe as a partner. There'll be just less bandwidth in European capitals to work with us in places like the Middle East or Asia, or to help reinforce NATO's eastern flank and to get NATO more involved in the south, because there will be yet another existential crisis about what it means to be the EU and European, and how we deal with the UK as it is exiting. So I think it's very hard for the United States to say that this would be in our interest. Now, it may not be the disaster that many are predicting it would be. I'm not an economist. It seems to me intuitively that there's very few good things I can see coming of it in terms of the global economy. So, polls seem to be pretty close right now. So we'll hope for a certain outcome on Thursday.
Yes, please.
I'm Seth Stoddard. I'm serving in the administration as an Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security. Next week, the President's going to be going to Ottawa for the North American Leaders Summit. And the question I have is, thinking over the long run, over the next 10 years, how tempting is it to the United States and to the American people, thinking about North America and this 500, 600 million market that we have, fundamentally energy independent, to look at the rest of the world and view it as optional in terms of engaging in the way that we have in the past? I mean, are we going to be going to a crisis of our foreign policy, of kind of a temptation towards isolationism?
Oh, look, there's always that temptation, but I actually am one who does not. I'm more optimistic. I don't think it will gain much traction. It will certainly get a lot of attention. I think what you said is absolutely right, that what the President's been able to continue through, and this is a bipartisan project going back to the early 90s, of making North America and our relations with Canada and Mexico more cohesive and whole, has been a great achievement, and it's something that over the last 7 years, you know more than I do about this, has put us in a better position. And it's true that also things that we hoped for, but I have to be candid, didn't really expect to go as well as it did, meaning in the energy side, has put us in a different position in many places around the world. That feeds some of the anxieties in the Middle East, regardless of what we actually are doing on the ground. They see the price of oil, they see our growing energy independence. This is unquestionably in our interest, and I understand how from our Middle Eastern partners' perspective, this causes some uncertainty. But I don't see us sort of thinking, things are great in our neighborhood, and so we can just wall off the rest of the world. I mean, I think, first of all, Mexico and Canada and us are pretty deeply involved in Asia, so we're going to stay deeply involved. They're pretty deeply involved in Europe, and hopefully we'll get TTIP through probably in the next administration, and so even be more integrated with the transatlantic space economically. So I don't see that as a concern.
Yes, please.
Hi, thank you, Derek. My name is Lisa Samp. I'm here from CSIS, and I have a question related to the NSC, which, as you know, is everybody's favorite punching bag once leaving the administration. So I was hoping you could give us your insights on what changes, if any, you think need to be made to the next administration's National Security Council, and any reflections you have on this one.
So I just have to preface this because I can't resist. Lisa was my prized chief of staff when I worked at the Pentagon, until she was stolen from me by the evil White House in the form of Karen Donfried to, go where the cool kids work, right? So, of course, I hate the NSC and everything about it. No, just kidding. Look, there's been a lot of churn here in Washington on Obama White House, the NSC. It's too meddling, it's too overpowering, it gets in everybody's business. And I think, first of all, everyone's got to take a deep breath about this. I mean, look, this is not the Reagan administration, when Iran-Contra meant that two national security advisors were indicted for crimes while committed in office, right? This is not the Clinton administration, in which a an assistant secretary of state publicly on the record, his name was Richard Holbrooke, called the interagency process a, quote, gigantic stalemate machine prior to the Dayton Peace Accords in Bosnia. This was not the Bush administration with these epic fights between Don Rumsfeld and Condoleezza Rice, in which Rumsfeld would write snowflake after snowflake, belittling the NSC process and criticizing the way Rice ran things. I mean, so yes, was there dysfunction in the NSC? Absolutely. But my view is garden variety dysfunction. I mean, this was inherent dysfunction. Does this mean it was perfect and and things were couldn't be changed? Absolutely not. I think the NSC is too big, right? I mean, when I was on the NSC transition team in 2008, and so one of the things we looked at was how big the NSC had grown during the Bush years, when there were entire directorates of the NSC that did not exist before. The last time the Democrats had been in power, all the Homeland Security stuff, a lot of the CT apparatus. There was an entire Iraq War directorate, as Jim knows very well, because he was the Deputy National Security Advisor at the time. That was all there for good reason, but that, of course, meant a much larger NSC. Look, I think Susan Rice deserves great credit for trying to bring down the size of the NSC, and my understanding is they're on track to have it be no larger than it was when President Obama came into office. So that's around 400 folks. But Ivo and I served on the transition team together, and Ivo knows this. He's written books about this, so he's far more expert than I. But the time to make the change is at the very beginning of administration. For a variety of reasons, we did not make those changes at the beginning of the Obama administration. So the next president, whoever he or she will be, to use those first 100 days to take a close look at the NSC, because the trivia question, which Ivo can't answer because he's probably the only one in the room who knows it, is the only position at the NSC that is, by statute, has to be filled is the executive secretary. The executive secretary. Everything else is made up. So this is a way of saying that the president has a lot of leeway in how he or she designs the NSC, and they ultimately do get an NSC that is the support system that they desire.
So I'm going to turn to two former senior officials. First Ivo, and then Jim Jeffries.
Derek, congrats on the book.
Thanks.
I left the administration before you in order to write the book, and I'm still not done. So, triply congrats. Maybe it's the job I took.
Right. Yeah.
I want to go back to David's question about the perceptions of power. When I was writing my master's thesis a long time ago, I learned from Charles de Gaulle that being perceived as powerful is just as important as being powerful, and he was a master at it. And I want to go back to this question of being perceived as weak, because I don't think you really answered it. Mm-hmm. I do think that there is a general perception among, forget about the Washington blob, there's a general perception among many of our allies that we have played a strong hand weak. One, is that true? And two, what would you do differently in order to play a strong hand strong?
Mm-hmm. So I think Ivo read a draft of the book and helped improve it mightily, but I didn't take all of his comments, so he's leaving himself room to be critical. I'm ready. Yeah, right. But look, I think one of President Obama's projects has been to try to redefine how we think about strength, and that's tough to do. And it started by saying, look, it's not just about military power. It's about how we should think of ourselves here at home. It's about how we engage with the rest of the world. It's about our diplomacy. It's about development. Obviously, Secretary Clinton was a big part of this when she was Secretary of State. But still in Washington, around the world, the definition of strength is military engagement. And I think that frustrates him a lot, because and he says this, he said it to Goldberg, he said it to many reporters, said it to you, I'm sure, many times. Like, it's not just how many people we bomb that should be the thing that we're known for. So, and I think he's leaving office trying to continue to make this case, and it may not work. I think he's right about it, so it's incumbent upon us who agree with him to continue to make this case. And I think, we've seen examples of where the kind of thinking that is seemingly strong in the moment and doing what seems as though it's the right thing to do for our credibility actually ends up undermining our strength and zapping our credibility and putting us into a hole that makes it very hard to dig out of. That said, what I think the president has struggled with, and I think any leader with his mindset will struggle with this, is the president is comfortable talking about, and not just comfortable talking about it, he believes it's important to talk about restraint and limits. Because he thinks it's the responsible thing to do, to say, look, we can't solve every problem. And it's when we've had the illusion of omnipotence is when we get ourselves in trouble. And in order to have a sane, rational conversation about America's role in the world and how we should use our finite resources is we need to talk about limits. Our American ethos doesn't like limits. And I get that, right? Because this is part of what makes us unique as a country is we can do anything. If we just put our minds to it and we make the right decisions, we can do anything. And there's no problem that can't be fixed. And there's part of the president that believes that. I mean, he's an American exceptionalist. I mean, he believes the very fact he's president of the United States shows that we can overcome mistakes, we can right wrongs. And so he's an exceptionalist, but he's also trying to be a realist. And it can be very hard to do. And it's one of the few areas, actually, it's important to note that I saw where Clinton and Obama, it wasn't so much a disagreement, but there was a different perspective. I mean, Clinton she believes in limits, she believes in the reality of limits, but she's also more comfortable talking about strength and being more aspirational. And I think that's part of the struggle. And I don't have a clean answer for that in terms of how you can talk about limits in a sensible, sober, fact-based way, but yet not be accused of not believing in American leadership or greatness.
So last question from Jim Jeffrey.
Okay. I was about to can this because of David's last question and then Ivo's, but now I've decided it all weaves together well. As you know, I have not read a draft of your book, but some of us in the blob would have a somewhat different definition of traditional, single-minded, security-based national leadership and power. Not, the military hammer, but rather persuading, convincing, or deterring others from using that military hammer against our global security system upon which much rests. Now, we started with your thesis that we're much safer and stronger today than we were 8 years ago. Is that a fair?
We're in a better position today.
Better position,
But
okay.
There are threats out there.
Okay, all right. Here's the thing. And we talked a lot about the Middle East, that's what I worked in, but to be fair, this administration inherited a portfolio of problem children, North Korea and about 8 in the Middle East. The next administration is inheriting basically at a certain level of abstraction that same portfolio of problem children. North Korea is worse. Iran, I think, at least on the nuclear front, is better. The rest of it is there. The difference in looking at the last 8 years is we now have 2 very significant near-peer powers pressing our security system militarily, Russia and China. Your response to David, who started tapping into this with Russia, was kind of and it reminds me a lot of President Obama's, that you actually did it better than he sometimes does. Well, but what do they bring to the G20 meetings? They have this old-fashioned, they don't have the Obama definition of what real national security is, so who cares? Mm-hmm. The problem is, lots of Americans care and lots of allies care. What's your answer to why, despite what they're doing in the South China Sea, East China Sea, Ukraine, Crimea, Syria, including a near military incident in the air over southern Syria 3 days ago? Mm-hmm.
Well, again, Jim, it's not as though Russia and China were these placid, easy problems in 2008. I mean, you know that better than I. I mean, China, in my view, is one of the 2 countries that benefited the most from the policies of the previous U.S. administration. The other was Iran. While the United States economy was going down the tubes, while the United States was bogged down in the Middle East, it was China that was trying to change the game fundamentally. Russia, my recollection, it was August of 2008, was when Russia went into Georgia. So Russia was pressing the security system of wider Europe then. The question to me is not, are Russia and China problems? And I would actually argue China is marginally less, only because of it's plateaued a bit over the last several years for a variety of reasons. It's what position are we in to do something about it? And doing something about it meaning pushing back directly when necessary. Doing something about it means bringing other countries by our side to, in concert, push back. To be a lead by example, to be a beacon for others. I feel like we're in a better place today than we were 8 years ago. That's not to say that China's totally fine and it's no problem, and that Russia's totally fine and it's no problem. They're both huge challenges to the United States and are, in their own ways, bucking the system and trying to change the system that we have helped create and have been the stewards of for so many years. But I do think we are in a better position to deal with those challenges today than we were 8 years ago. But you remain unconvinced. But this is for a longer conversation.
So, with apologies to those whose hands I couldn't recognize, this is the great debate. This is the debate that matters, and this is a terrific book. And thank you very much,
Thanks,
Derek,
David. Thanks,
for
everybody.
talking about it with us.
Thanks.